My name is Greg Downs, and I and my co-editor, Kate Mazer, are delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Journal of the Civil War Era to today's talk, which I'll introduce in just a moment. This is one of a series of talks that Kate and I have sponsored during the summer to try to make up a bit for the absence of the kind of conferences and public gatherings that might have taken place in the late spring and summer, and create spaces where people can hear engaged discussions of historical topics. This is the second of these invited speaker talks. We first had a seminar on a workshop on submitting to journals, and that is kept now at the YouTube page for the Journal of the Civil War Era. Our first talk was Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner on Thursday, July 23rd. Following today, we have two more scheduled. Dr. Thomas Brown on Civil War Monuments and the Militarization of America on Wednesday, August 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And then a rescheduled talk, originally intended for last week, but rescheduled because of the tropical storm, which is Dr. Tira Hunter on emancipation during the Civil War. And that'll be Wednesday, August 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. These are on the Journal of the Civil War Era webpage under a link for muster, and we can post that link for people to see. For each of those talks like this one, we do ask you to pre-register ahead of time for it to enable us to manage the format through Zoom. So we invite you to see the pieces that have already been posted, to come back for the few ones to come, and to get ready for what it will be, I am certain, an especially exciting and invigorating talk today. I'll introduce our speaker, and then Kate Mazer will come in to ask the first question. So we are delighted today to welcome Professor Stephanie McCurry, who is the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History in honor of Dwight Eisenhower. Professor McCurry has an extremely distinguished career with 3 books, all of which were prize-winning and drew intense scholarly notice and public notice, beginning with Masters of Small Worlds, Yeoman Households, Gender Relations, and the Political Culture of the Antebellum South Carolina Lowcountry, and then Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and which, like Masters of Small Worlds, won many prizes. And continuing last year with her book, Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War. Professor McCurry has won many of the leading prizes in the field: Merle Curdy, Willie Lee Rose, Avery Craven, John Hope Franklin, Frederick Douglass prizes, among others, as well as awards for her teaching of undergraduate and graduate education, which I was lucky enough to experience firsthand what now seems like a long time ago. So we are delighted to have Stephanie McCurry join us today to talk both generally about the Confederacy and specifically about the ways that her work has transformed our understanding of the Confederacy. So with that, we welcome you here, and I'll turn things over to Kate.
All right, thanks so much, Greg, for the introduction. Welcome to everyone who's here, and welcome to Dr. Stephanie McCurry. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to quickly say something about the format today. We're going to run about an hour, so we'll end around 5 o'clock Eastern Time. Greg and I have a few questions for Stephanie McCurry, which we'll ask, and the participants should be able to ask questions using the Q&A button that you should see on your screen, and we will be able to see any questions that you ask, and we'll go ahead and some of you submitted questions ahead of time, and we've integrated some of those into our own questions. We got a lot of questions from you, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can, although it's unlikely that we'll be able to get to all of them. And then later on, with about 20 minutes or so left in the conversation, we'll switch over to the questions that you all, we hope, will ask that will come in over the transom today. So I'm really looking forward to your participation in this event as well. So I want to start with just a really general question, Stephanie. Earlier this summer, you published an article in The Atlantic, which gave a very brief and very clear overview of your vision of the Confederacy, which drew a great deal on your 2010 book, Confederate Reckoning, The title of the Atlantic article was "The Confederacy was an anti-democratic centralized state." And I'm sure you probably didn't write that headline, but it did pretty well encapsulate some of the central points of the article. You argued the Confederacy is not part of our American heritage, as President Donald Trump recently claimed, nor should it stand as a libertarian symbol of small government and resistance to federal tyranny. The Confederate States of America was a pro-slavery nation at war against the United States. It was a big centralized state devoted to securing a society in which enslavement to white people was the permanent and inherited condition of all people of African descent. Tell us why you wrote the article this summer when you did. And for those who didn't have a chance to read it, tell us the basics. Who created the Confederacy and for what purposes?
Thanks, Kate, and thank you, Greg. Thank you guys for inviting me. It's been interesting revisiting this subject of the Confederacy 10 years after I published the book, many more than that after I started researching it. The title that I gave the article for the Atlantic was "What the Confederacy Really Was." And it really grew out of a tweet, believe it or not. There was so much stuff about monuments. I think actually a number of articles this summer have grown out of tweets, and mine wasn't even a thread, it was just a tweet. And it was really that I was watching and participating in all the conversation about the tearing down the monuments. And it was quite clear to me that you couldn't assume that people understood what the Confederacy even was. I mean, why is it the OG symbol of white supremacy, basically, was what I was saying to myself. We, in a funny way, we seem to know more about the post-Civil War period when the statues were erected. It's a little closer to the history we're living and still trying to contend with. What the Confederacy was as a real thing as opposed to a symbol. And I have always been more interested in the Confederacy than in the memory, or at least what I should say is I was more interested in what the Confederacy was, because as Greg knows, I was one of those people who came at the Civil War from the antebellum period, sort of like a running jog, you know, and in many ways, my work about the Confederacy and about Reconstruction is influenced by that sense of, well, what did slavery mean and how difficult was it to destroy it as an institution in American life? So I titled the article, "What the Confederacy Really Was." And then you face this challenge of writing basically a 1,000-word version of a book. And, you know, that wasn't easy. So I basically, what I wanted to convey was in many ways the reason, one of the things that I think Confederate Reckoning was trying to do in the first place was make it clear not why the Confederacy lost, which was the dominant question in the historiography, but why it was established, and you know what kind of a nation did they want to build? Why did they leave the Union? Like, what was their grievance? What was the cause? What kind of nation did they want to build? And what happened when they tried to do that? So the Atlantic piece focused on really only on what kind of a nation did they want to build. It couldn't say much about why they left the Union, although that's related. So really all I was trying to say was that they, you know, it was a long-standing desire on the part of a particular slaveholding political elite, especially in a few leading states. And the desire was to it was done out of confidence, but it was also done out of a sense that the ship was sailing, that Lincoln had been elected. They no longer could hold the kind of electoral clout that they had in the antebellum period. And they took this risk, this enormous risk, that slavery would be safer out of the Union than within the Union. And that had been debated since the 1830s at least. So it wasn't easy to pull this off, which is something that has always interested me. But I really didn't go into that either. And I just sort of wanted to try to convey what the purposes of the foundation of the Confederacy was. That, I mean, even on the citizenship test, there's still two right answers to what caused the Civil War. The right answer is slavery, and you can also say states' rights. Well, you know, this is something we really should do something about. I took that citizenship test. I was like beside myself. But so, you know, who created the Confederacy and for what purposes? That basically a political elite that was on the extreme separatist end of the Democratic Party in the South, who had to defeat the moderates within the party and couldn't until Lincoln was elected. And then they did, but they still faced, and they had very explicit pro-slavery purposes. There was no bullshit about, you know, I mean, they did incorporate a lot of stuff about states' rights, but every state made it clear in their declarations of independence, so to speak, that this was about slavery and about money and capital. And, that obfuscation about the causes all started after. So I wanted to make it clear that the documents were blunt and frank in time and place, the statements of intention and purpose, and then the founding documents of the Confederacy, the Constitution they wrote, the way the Vice President recommended it to white Southerners as superior to the original Constitution. I mean, there's this kind of myth that the Confederate Constitution is a copy of the U.S. Constitution, which it is not. And then to try to say quickly at what point those kind of motives got obscured. But I also just wanted to point out that, how can this serve as a libertarian symbol of small government when political scientists like Bensell regard it, if you measure the size of the central state and the Confederacy compared even to the Union, one of the great ironies that I was trying to cope with in Confederate Reckoning is because they didn't have a kind of developed industrial society and big financial markets, the War Department and the Confederate government basically had to do, once they got into war, they had to do everything that was required to build up the capacity to make war, and they did it through the central states. The individual southern states didn't have the capacity to do that. So the Constitution was written as if it was the perfection of this small government. State sovereignty was explicit. But the minute the war started, Davis and his administration by necessity became these people who embodied a form of centralization that was way in excess of what the Union did during the war. So those were the two main things that I was trying to convey. I was also trying to convey that we shouldn't build, that this really was a civil war, and that the United States, what is now the United States, at one point was two different countries, which people keep forgetting. And that I don't know how many countries build monuments to, the tyrant they defeated. They took those lines out. So they didn't, there was a few provocations in there about that. But, I think it's a very weird post-war history that made that myth so powerful and disseminate commercially viable.
Thanks so much. You covered a lot of ground there about myths of the Confederacy that historians, war against, and that you helped lead some of the war against. And I wanted to follow up just with one of them that you mentioned. And then I think, we'll try and turn the latter part of the discussion more toward the research you did that focused on what would happen if we understood the gendered and patriarchal nature of political culture in the South in the antebellum period, how it shaped the secession, how it ended up shaping the Confederacy, and some of those aspects. But before we jump into that, you talked about a number of myths, including the idea of a states' rights confederacy and why that doesn't work. The idea of consensus and cohesion in the Confederacy and why that, collapses in a number of ways. And you also mentioned, the idea of the Confederate Constitution. And since you've also done public work on this, and I love using with my classes your annotated Confederate Constitution, like you, I wonder, without, asking you to be, comprehensive, but I wonder if you could just fill in some of our readers, some of our listeners and viewers, what you think are the key takeaways when we start to actually pay attention to the Confederate Constitution and how it differs from the U.S. Constitution?
Yeah, that was really a fun thing to do for the New York Times. What was it, the Sesquicentennial? You guys all did some great stuff for that. First of all, the first line of the Constitution puts, I haven't read it in a while, but it puts us under God. It puts them under God. It establishes the sovereignty of the individual states. In a way, it's a cleanup act. Everything that had agitated them about the original imperfect Constitution in the 70 years of its existence, they were trying to correct. So it was explicitly a Christian nation under God. It was the sovereignty of the individual states was explicit and less multiple, which in practice got overridden by this central state to some degree. It had certain kinds of conservative elements, like a one-term presidency, which I don't focus very much on, but it's interesting. But the key things were they took out all the word slave or slavery does not appear in the original Constitution. There's a lot of euphemisms, other persons held to servitude and labor. They took all that out. It just says slave, 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 slave. It's wallpaper. No embarrassment there, no problem. Moreover, they provide, there had always been a fight over whether slaveholders could take their slaves into the territory. They made that explicit. That was, the property rights follow the owner. So that, and that also tells you that they expected to expand, which they did for about 18 months or 24 months, and to the west especially, well, as you know. And so they provided for that. They put it beyond the right of the central. I think the most important thing is in creating this central government, which was not supposed to be a powerful centralized government, they explicitly deprived the central government of any power now or in the future to ever interfere with the legality of slavery. So and I get all kinds of people harass me about this, because they say, well, individual states could still do it. Well, of course, but none did. But they basically, this became a huge problem in the Confederacy at the end of the war when they wanted to enlist Black soldiers and they couldn't free them. And they had to go begging to the individual states like Virginia to change the law of the state. They would have had to get every state to change the law, and that didn't work. So if you read the Constitution, the parts that I annotated mostly focus on the places where they rendered explicit their commitment to slavery, not just in the present, but in future acquired territory and in future time.
Thanks so much for that. I guess I feel like one of the things that's become, thanks to your work and just the general conversation, it's become increasingly obvious, and we increasingly know where to turn to emphasize that the people who created the Confederacy themselves made no bones about the reality that they were trying to preserve slavery, that they were trying to create a nation whose central goal and central distinction from the United States was to preserve slavery. But one of the things that you've really drawn attention to in your work on the Confederacy and also in your more recent work is the importance of patriarchy and ideas about patriarchy for the formation of the Confederacy, and the ways in which both kind of patriarchy and ideas about brotherhood, ideas about manhood were really important and intersected and really were inseparable from these ideas about human bondage and racism in the creation of the Confederacy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and in particular, maybe you could talk a little about how you teach that, or how you like to describe it when you're in the classroom.
Yeah, well, for me, this is probably the deepest commitment I have of all of my intellectual commitments. It's about the integration, it's about relations of power and gender as a central, the central relation of power. It's the one that's most transcultural, transhistorical, transnational, but it's built into all these other relations of power in any given society that change over time. So do gender relations of power change over time. But the fact that there's a fundamental asymmetry between women and men is not basically contested. I mean, we're in 2020, we're still dealing with this. So in Masters of Small Worlds, and my dissertation, that was the hardest thing I was trying to figure out, is it was quite clear to me in a social and cultural sense that these households were organized in a patriarchal way, and that those patriarchal assumptions were crucial to their understanding that the way a family and a household was organized internally, and the sense of organic power relations that come out of the family or the household, have fundamental meanings for public electoral politics. The question is, the difficult part was how to demonstrate that. And so in Masters of Small Worlds, I was interested in trying to figure out why it is that defenders of slavery always use marriage as an analogy for slavery. And this was when the switch really went on for me. And it was the first thing I ever published, is that why would publicists for slavery say slavery is just like marriage? Well, feminists would say, well, so pro-slavery people say slavery is just like marriage. It's a relation of domination designed to protect the weak. Okie doke. And it's Christian. The Bible ordains it. It's the organic family, and it's the Christian family order. Now, this is a powerful platform to this day on which to make a conservative argument. And even though by the 1830s and 40s, radicals, abolitionists, and feminists were making the counter argument that marriage is like slavery, to this day, that's not as powerful an argument as the one that, you know, the conservative family order ordains a patriarchal arrangement of power. And it, you know, to even in our own families, are these egalitarian institutions. It is not, it's a much more winning argument for conservatives than it is for radicals. So that was the basis of it. And then the question was, well, so it's quite clear that ideologically and culturally, this evangelical Christianity did a lot of the work of legitimizing slavery to people who didn't own slaves, and gave them a stake in it in a way that was really fundamental and felt, not just out there. So the other thing that I noticed is that politically, the argument was always, we free men. They weren't stupid. Pro-slavery politicians didn't go out and say, oh, you know, us slaveholders are really going to lose a lot of money if you don't vote with us. There was incredibly antagonistic class relations between poor whites, yeoman farmers, and elites in these areas. The argument they made was a version of the Christian family argument. They say, we're all free men, and in this world, you don't do manual labor for any white man. You are as much a free man as me. So that was the language of political appeal. And it came very naturally out of a Republican political conception of the Republic as a sort of, not a democracy, but a place where a subset of men would be empowered. And, you know, they would have preferred to be able to call the shots themselves, but they could live with this, is sort of the way I understand it. So I think that it really has, and so that's the way I teach it. The minute I teach my students about how marriage and slavery are linked and why it works and how it was used, and then try to talk to them about the ways in which it becomes, the argument isn't that slavery is like marriage. It's about the linked relations of domination that order this society and which are seen as twins. And, you know, Amy Stanley and other people have done wonderful work also in explaining how this works in legal domains and other domains. So I think that's the linchpin. And I think a lot of it is understanding that more than 50% of defenses of slavery in the United States were written by evangelical ministers, white evangelical ministers. Let's be clear. So I don't think we've really grappled with that. It's a lot to think through.
It is, and one of the, or go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the other thing is, abolitionists were, the argument was that abolitionists weren't just attacking slavery, they were attacking the Christian family, and that's a zinger. I mean, that's just like, if Trump had these talking points, we'd be done for. So I think that, you know, it's a powerful argument, and it worked.
In your picking up in the thread, both chronologically in the history of the country and no less momentously in the history of Stephanie McCurry, in your next project, you carried some of these concerns and added other ones, but carried some of these concerns with the nature of patriarchy, the political culture of gender and of gendered language, and the ways that women would respond to this patriarchal political culture into the Confederacy itself in order to make arguments about some of the fractures and divisions and crises, internal crises of the Confederacy. And I wonder, for our viewers who somehow haven't read Confederate Reckoning, if you would take them you know, through the connections of what happens as you trace these questions, and of course add others, into the wartime years, and how this feeds in some ways to the point you started with about how we understand the Confederacy as a whole, or what it would mean to really understand the Confederacy. It's like bread riots is the one that my students always, when you get to that and they're like, oh, I get it, right? This sort of,
yeah, no, it's easy, right? And for me, that was a funny thing. That was the part of that book that just fell into place for me immediately, was I was reading these governor's papers. Actually, Greg, you were getting some of them for me, as I recall. I think I had a 13-month-old baby when I was reading, and I was living in California, so I was reading photocopies of huge rafts of governor's papers from Georgia and North Carolina, and initially Georgia and North Carolina. And by about year 2 of the war, there's this trickle of letters from women to the very semi-literate, barely literate letters to various Southern governors that are signed "we soldiers' wives," or just use the term "soldiers' wives." And I thought, well, this is interesting. This is some leverage they never had before. And I had read antebellum petitions. I had read these governors' letters for 1860, 61. And it was just this literally index of the politicization of women and the growing recognition by politicians of them as a constituency that they can't ignore. And so, this was no surprise to me in a sense. Because I had written about secession before, I knew a good deal about the beginning of the war, the causes of the war. It's kind of stunning to see the masculinity of the terms, just of the grammar of political appeals in this period. So like we free men, but way beyond that, we men, we worship, we have to come to the defense of the mother. Like seriously, how do you not analyze that language? Like, why are they're calling individual men to the defense of the state, who's the mother, or and they're also creating a threat that your sisters and your mother and sisters are going to be violated. The barbarians are at the threshold of the household. So this, but the women are just ventriloquized. They're lollipop heads. They're not real women. So then you start to see these women speaking, and it's not any sign that anybody had before, but it is a sign that comes out of the appeals for mobilization. Give us your men, we will protect you. Okay, 18 months later, okay, you said X, we're saying Y. And it's not elite women. Elite women, if they want something from the government, they get their lawyer to write a letter. And they say, do you know me? I'm the daughter of so-and-so. I think you know my brother. And this is, get my man out of the war kind of thing. And of course, they have many means of approach to governors and to politicians. Non-slaveholding women, yeoman women, poor white women, they're on these farms. Their men are being mobilized at much higher rates. They can't do this work on their own. These are farms. It's an agrarian society. And they're finally starting to collectively demand that local government, state government usually, but there's letters to Jefferson Davis and the Secretary of War as well. So they're making these demands. So basically, I think if you watch just the mailbags of these governors or of the Secretary of War, what I realized was, people have used these letters before, but they always thought, okay, this is the poor people. Well, wait a minute. No, this is poor white women. This is a home front that's organizing. And then, so we knew about the bread riots before, but we never knew how they were organized. We still don't know about some of them. They're not spontaneous, clearly. They come with signs, bread or blood. Like that takes organization. And there's this rolling pattern, which has fascinated people. Are they copycat? But because I had read so consistently in the governor's letters and the Secretary of War letters, I knew they knew this was coming. And I knew some of the same people who had written these letters were in these events. And then, so in other words, the bread riots are the tip of the iceberg. And there actually is a lot more going on. And this, there's a local politics, a state level, mostly local politics of women. So the beginning of the book asks, who are the people? And at the beginning of the war, these people who are organizing secession and the building of the Confederacy, they think the people are the voters, and that's white men, and it's a very small proportion of the Confederate population. The war starts, there's two huge populations who are not even considered part of the people. Everybody who's enslaved, especially everybody who's enslaved, turns the fate of the Confederacy, I think, in an entirely different direction. And there is these non-elite women who are trying to survive the war. And only a small proportion of whom I would say are openly anti-slavery, but many of them are anti-Confederate, or they become anti-Confederate. So that's what I think. And, I was interested in the fact that there's not much available to them. They don't say we citizens, they say we soldiers' wives. Nobody has ever handed them a handle on political. They're rural. There's no letterhead. Like if you go to the Schlesinger Library, you can see the New York Women's Organization sending out printed letterheads for signature. There's no letterhead. There's no organization, and I think that stumps people. They don't know how to do research on unorganized people, on rural people. But there's a lot of records that will allow you to do it.
I wanted to zoom back out for a second, and all right, I've got two kind of questions in mind. One is to kind of zoom back out, and one of the things that I think is striking about your book, Confederate Reckoning, and probably it sounds like it was a little bit of what was cut out of the Atlantic article, but just this presentation of the Confederacy actually as very vulnerable, as incredibly fractured from within, Confederate leaders facing a tremendous amount of dissent, not just from white men who weren't sure they wanted to fork over as many men for the draft as, governors and things like that, but from these white women who were, rioting out of hunger, from enslaved people who were never on board, obviously, in the first place. And just to kind of ask you to think or talk a little bit about what the implications of that, and right now I think people are frequently mentioning, the Confederacy was 4 years. Why are we all talking about the Confederacy lasted 4 years? That was shorter than, whatever. By the time I spent in high school, it was whatever. What is that, the kind of actually the vulnerability and the tenuousness in many ways and the lack of success of the Confederacy? What does thinking about that tell us about, thinking about the reality of the Confederacy in those kind of terms, tell us about the memory of it now, and how did it become such a behemoth? How did it become so important in our memory? That's one question. My other question, totally different, so you can choose which one is thinking about those forms of dissent. So the bread riots, women, storming stores and cities, demanding, some kind of protection in response for their men going away to war and being killed, or enslaved people refusing to work, running away, joining the other side in the war. What does that tell us about how we understand politics? What kinds of politics are we seeing there that aren't taking the form of like voting? What is your view of how maybe power works in general and what should be considered political? So those are two completely different questions, and hopefully we can get to both of them.
Hey, two tiny little questions there.
Yeah,
huh?
right.
Well, let me just say something quickly about the first one, because I think the second one is a little more complicated. I think I did say this in the Atlantic article. I think they left this in. Like, nobody loved Jefferson Davis in 1865. Nobody was building statues to him or lionizing the Confederacy in 1865. That all, he had to be imprisoned. He had to be so-called martyred, which is not really true. And then it really is in the 1870s and late and after that this sort of embrace, we know a lot about white slaveholding women afterwards, sort of, taking on this cultural project of resuscitating the Confederacy. And that takes time, but I wanted to make it clear that that's a myth, that required the Confederacy to be defeated. If it had continued, you wouldn't have monuments of the Confederacy all over the place. You'd have civil liberties, people crying bloody murder as they did at the time. They opposed conscription, they opposed taxation. They wasn't it in North Carolina? Didn't the North Carolina Supreme Court play out the conscription thing all the way to the end? So I wanted to make that clear, that people need to understand that there's not very much here to admire, and nobody thought that. There's nothing there to admire, but it's not just me. People at the time thought that. So the mythic part, which interests me a great deal more now than it did when I was working on, the antebellum and war period, is, it's a challenging thing, but the British Empire got defeated all over the world and managed to maintain this image of itself as, the great emancipatory power. So clearly we need to think a little, we are getting great work on this even now. And then the other question about what this kind of approach, if I take what your point, Kate, you're kind of asking, both, you're asking a methodological question, but also a contemporary political question. Is that the case?
Sure, go for it, both ways.
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, you know, for me, there's something about, if you're interested in power, which is the way it's what interests me about the past, is what the array of power was. Then, you know, this gender part comes more naturally, I think, to me. I don't understand how people can write about power and not write about gender, but clearly I'm in the minority. But I think what it does is it makes it clear that electoral politics is like the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg of what's going on in any society in terms of negotiations around legitimacy, the extent of allowable violence, what a state is allowed to do, and also that in the vast reaches of history, a lot of the most important contestations over power and consolidation of political power happened in the states and in localities, and that, you know, these are not irrelevant. We can't just look at, I mean, to me, to look at Confederate politics as how people voted in the Confederate state legislatures or in the Confederate Congress would be like, you know, just it's being duped by the deal they made, which is, you know, like that. In other words, the most important thing to know about a political system is how are the boundaries drawn, who's in and who's out, who's empowered and who's not. And if we don't ask that question, then how are we doing political history? Once they're in and they're saying, oh, should we give this guy 10 cents or this guy 50 cents? Okay, not irrelevant, but it's not exactly the big stakes game. And so for me, political history is about whose political history it is. And electoral politics is one part of that. And it matters, like it matters if judges in, you know, a county in Georgia in 1869 are Republican or Democrat. It matters a lot. And our elections matter a lot. But especially when you have like 2/3 of the population disenfranchised, like you do in a slaveholding society or in Reconstruction before the Military Reconstruction Act, then what are we talking about? Like, how do you do electoral politics talking about, you know, voters? And so for me, I guess the contemporary relevance of that is one of the things that this moment, I think, has brought back to us. I mean, why is Manisha Sinha writing an article in the New York Times today about Gandhi and about anti-colonial, the decolonization movement in India? Why does BLM remind me of the civil rights movement in Belfast in 1969? Because all of that stuff was going on the streets, in the communities, under the radar. It broke into the media usually when there was violence, when there was repression. You can suppress those people. You can kill them, you can break them, and you can break a movement, but you can't permanently stop it. And I think that's the moment we're in now. And I think, I mean, I don't want to sound grandiose, but I think we need to, the way we think about our own politics, we need to, like, for example, when I was a graduate student, there was an centerpiece of political, the right wing was anti-abortion. Well, that's a private issue. That's a family issue. That's a religious issue. So if we know that that's a key political issue in our own time, and it's tied to personal, private life, gender relations, racial relations, why are we not so aware? Why are we not able to have that recognition of the past? That politics isn't just what political historians label politics. So that's a pet peeve of mine. And I know I had to make my career in a field where people would say, at best, they would say, well, that's interesting, but it's not politics. And it's not political history, because there was or is a kind of hierarchy of significance. And it's a way of, what's the word? It trivializes gender analysis. It's a way of trivializing whole areas of research.
Picking up on this, actually, before I ask the question, just for the viewers, we're getting questions coming in on the Q&A. We also have the pre-submitted questions, and we're going to start using those to pull together questions, some of which go directly to some of the points that you were just making, Stephanie, about relationship of past and present through politics. Before we do that, I wondered if we could just also get to women's war. And if you had developed a large part of your career upon the blind spots of political history and of the centrality of gender and of the presence of women to political history, that one of the things that you're developing in Confederate Reckoning, but really comes to the forefront in women's war, is that the blind spot in military history and in the military history of the Civil War is at least as big, if not bigger. And so I wonder if you can talk about what helped, whether that felt to you sort of something immediately coming out of Confederate Reckoning, or if it represented to you a term, and what you think makes the what you argue there and or think now makes the Civil War and military history more broadly beyond limited, but makes it small and constrained in the ways you talked about political history, when it doesn't look at these questions of both gender and the actual presence of women.
Yeah. I mean, I started thinking, I think if I had a different, I started thinking about the military history question when I was writing Confederate Reckoning. And I put in bits here and there. It was almost like placeholders, where it was clear to me that military historians don't think enough about slavery, for example. And I tried to make it clear that I think this is a fundamental lacuna in the military history of the Civil War, is, a lot of military strategies were based on keeping slaves in, and like Confederate military strategies, keeping slaves in and instead of, letting them out, instead of keeping Union troops out. So where are they stationed? Anyway, there's a whole interesting sort of sub-history in there of how their attempt to control slaves shaped their military strategy or the deployment of military forces during the war. And I mean, I'm sure people have written about this, but it's not enough, I don't think. And so I started thinking about it there. And then I got really interested in, when I was writing about these North Carolina, especially North Carolina women who were involved in, and Virginia women who were involved in bread riots, I was interested in the way the Confederate military was sent in to repress them. And this was a huge problem during the war, is that it was clear so I guess the short answer is that when I was writing Confederate Reckoning, I could see that the military was being directed against guerrilla bands in the Confederacy, and to go after the guerrillas, they had to go after the women. That this is the way, everybody knows this is how partisan forces work. Every war, it's true. Every war, when it's over, it's denied. So it's more obvious with non-regular forces. And so I got alerted to this when I was doing the stuff on the Confederacy, but I knew that there was a problem with Confederate women in Union territory. And I knew that that was more important legally because of Francis Lieber's code. So that was the connection. I was at loose ends after I had all this leftover stuff, and I started working on Francis Lieber and Lieber's code and international law. And I started to realize that this was not a minor issue, but that Halleck had weighed in heavily in the writing of Lieber's code precisely because they had a serious problem controlling women spies, partisans, telegraph, all kinds of military operators especially in Tennessee, but in the border South in general. So I wrote that article that was in Law and History Review, and then it's the first chapter of Women's War. And it was really fun. I got really into international law. That was so cool. And then I found out that, I kept asking people, well, non-combatant status, this is an association of innocence with gender, right? With women. Everybody like, never, the only person who had really done this was a political theorist, Helen Kinsella. And not for, she had written a little bit about the American Civil War, but it was a big, really helpful picture at the theory level. So that was another eye-opener. Like, how do they not know this? From Victoria on, it says, the list of who's exempt from military service and cannot be treated as a combatant starts with women, and then others who have qualities like them. So that was just really interesting. And then when I did women's war, I started to realize that I had these pieces that had, I became more rather than less worked up about the women's and gender history. I'd always done gender history. I had never written anything directly about women, only women before. And I just thought, well, I still feel really passionate about this. I don't feel that I'm not confident that for all of the things that we're doing better in our discipline, that we really are doing better in gender history. I still think it's kind of cordoned off in ways that it should not be. And you're completely right, Greg. I started to feel the same way about, I wanted to write the book because I could, in general, because I can't believe people can still write history without any women in it. That's the general sort of galvanizing disbelief. Like, it's 2020. Are we still doing this? What's your problem? Here they are. They say non-combatant. They say innocent. They say women. It's right there. They say marriage. They say slavery. It's right there. But then I started to realize that the question of war itself was this, like, male subject, you know, it's Antigone, you know, Antigone, she doesn't care whether the brother is loyal or a traitor. She only cares that it's her brother. And that's her state is the family. Her state is love of the family. And I don't know why women can't be allowed to be political beings, you know, why they can't, you know, yeah, I love my kids. Yes, I love my family, but I also care whether Ireland is occupied by the British Army. Okay, this is not like an abstraction. And I don't understand why people think that women stand around and watch history float by their window, protecting their men. Like, seriously, we swim in these waters. We have to operate in them. Nobody gives us an exemption from the taxes or penalties of politics. So that was why I wrote it. You can see it gets me very agitated.
That was an awesome brief for women's history, and particularly the history of women in war. And I hope that lots of people will take you up on this provocation to, you know, continue to follow in this line of questioning and research. We're going to turn to some questions that have come in, and we're combining a few questions around different topics. So there's one set of questions that people are wanting to ask you having to do with white slaveholding women, white supremacist women. So the questions are sort of, for example, how do women enslavers in the Confederacy play out in your understanding of this history? So not the bread rioters necessarily, although some of them might have been slave owners as well, but also, you know, maybe elite white women who were very invested in slavery and white supremacy, and a kind of correlated question about, do you find that it's complicated or surprising to talk about white supremacist women in a context in which sometimes people assume, although I don't know how often that's true today, that white women in particular have progressive or good politics, when we know from history that you know, is not at all the case. But do you get into kind of complicated conversations about those issues?
Yeah, these are great questions, and they're coming up a lot in public discussion now. And I think there's a lot more sort of acute, there's a lot more sharp thinking around this. And I mean, in this respect, I think a lot of people are reading and thinking about Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, which I admire a great deal. And I see sometimes, you know, the suggestion that there's something contradictory maybe between what she's saying and what I'm saying. And I just don't see that. I mean, the idea that first of all, yeomen and poor white women, for the most part, aren't anti-slavery. I have never suggested that they were. Even in the Quaker Belt and in some parts of East Tennessee, yes, you can find, you know, admirable individuals who committed themselves to the abolitionist cause during the war, but they're far fewer in number. And I never suggested that the white women that I write, these poor white women that I write about their class politics, that they're anything other than white supremacists. I try to be quite explicit about that. Maybe the language wasn't as explicit in 2008 or 2010 than I would use now, but I certainly don't think that at all. I mean, I understand exactly well, I was always aware of what role white women slaveholders and slavers play in the discipline and violence of the slaveholding system. I think what Stephanie Jones Rogers' work does is lay out in much greater detail their investment in it from their education from children on. I mean, this is wonderfully done, and I very much agree. And I think she's 100% correct. The only thing, I guess, that I would, it's not so much a difference, it's a different focus, which is that if you're writing about, so these slaveholding women, I think, are operating in a situation where they are capable of both owning legally and exercising power physically over people they claim as their property. But they're also doing it in a patriarchal system that concedes certain kinds of public power to their husbands and not to them. So that when I study, so I'm not sure from Professor Jones Rogers' book what proportion of women legally own these people. To her, that's not the crucial question, and I understand why. That's true. On a day-to-day basis, it doesn't matter whether you own them or not, but sometimes it does. So for the slaveholding women themselves. So I don't think we have incompatible views here. I think she took one end of the problem. And so when I look at and Women's War, for example, the last chapter of the book, which is a sort of down payment on the kind of post-war book I want to write, you know, somebody like Gertrude Thomas is a white supremacist dyed in the wool. She's an evolving kind of a one. Her pro-slavery white supremacy is destroyed. She has to reconstruct it. The destruction of slavery, Professor Jones Rogers is not only right, she's right. Think about what it means to have a psychology like that and then to be trying to live through an enforced emancipation. Your subjectivity, it has to be reconstructed. And we know from history that you can't, it's very hard to denazify a whole society. So I think that I'm in some ways at that individual level trying to grapple with that issue, not in any way that, at least I hope it doesn't read as just sympathetic. What I'm trying to say is the destruction of slavery is not a one and done kind of thing. You have to undo, it was disseminated through every element of life and the self, and it has to be destroyed and rebuilt. And that's an enormous undertaking. And when we talk about what Reconstruction can or cannot accomplish, we have to think about that level of the individual, the sort of almost, you know, the person whose psychology has been shaped by this. We kind of got scared off those questions as historians at a certain point in the 20th century. And I, you know, for very good reason then, but, and so I say this with great humility, like I don't have a lot of answers right now. But I think that I just think that, and in terms of the assumption that white women's politics is progressive, I wish that were true. And you don't have to, I mean, if you have read Elizabeth McCrae's recent book, Mothers of Massive Resistance, I mean, women are the foot soldiers of all these political movements, including the ones that are enforcing white supremacy in local school districts. So, and you know, and in the pro-segregationist, I don't know. Have you ever lived in a community where where there weren't right-wing women? I never have. So it follows necessarily, you know, from the divisions within communities. I think class, racial, national, colonial.
Thanks so much. We, you know, are approaching, amazingly enough already, toward the end of our time. We're going to pull together a couple last questions, pulling from different things that people either pre-submitted or submitted through the Q&A function. So we appreciate that. We have sort of two last things that we'll throw at you, Stephanie. One of which is this. You gestured to this before in your definition of politics, and I wonder if you could elaborate it on a little bit now, because a number of people asked about the relationship of the field that we're all in, but especially of your work, to contemporary political movements. And there's a couple different ways that the questions were framed, but one way it strikes me comes back to that question that you raised about what happens if we think more imaginatively and at a certain level at the same time more accurately and realistically about what politics is. And I wonder what you think. Some people asked in relationship to the movement for Black Lives, other people asked about other political movements. I want to give you enough room to take in the direction you want, but I wonder what you think is the relevance of what's the impact of those kind of questions upon the ways that we either understand or participate in the political moment that we're in right now.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's easier to say how it's going to shape the history questions we ask and write about, but how it, I mean, I don't know if this is one answer, and it's a very modest answer. I think I'm given to modest answers in this moment. I think all of us must be reminded of the value of what we do. Like, you can go a long stretch where nobody's asking you to write an article for the Atlantic or write an op-ed for the Washington Post. You could, like Karen Cox, she's been writing about, women and white supremacy and Confederate memorialization for decades. And thank God, because that store of knowledge is there when the moment comes and it is needed. And so part of it is, my feeling about this is, we have these stores of knowledge and we have longitudinal thinking about how we got here. I mean, I have gaps because, remember, I'm not an American, and I do American history from the late 18th century to the late 19th century. And what I know about the mid 20th century is less than a lot of people. And I know it about other parts of the world equally to what I know about the United States. So, but my way of thinking about the connection to politics in the current moment is that we have to participate with a knowledge that of what we can offer, I guess, is what my answer is, and that there's a role we can play, but it's not, from my point of view, it's not that far away from the role that I play as a writer and a teacher, because because that's where I can make a contribution, and that's where I feel that, I shouldn't be, not me, but white women, white historians shouldn't be necessarily in the lead in public debate and deliberation around these questions at the moment, about Kamala Harris and the history of Black women in politics and electoral politics and things like that. It's been amazing watching our colleagues step in. I just feel, I guess what I feel right now is that when Black Lives Matter started, at least this year's part, I was really scared because I'm always afraid these people are going to get killed. And it took me a while to realize that there was a lot of hope here, and that this is maybe one of those moments where you can't just run people over and, put it away. And at that point, I think one of the things that made me so full of hope is there's some kind of relationship between journalists and historians right now that just really does my heart good. I mean, there are Black journalists who are getting a bigger forum, a bigger public forum, and they've done a lot of reading and they know a lot, and they're translating it almost, and sometimes crediting historians, sometimes just using it, but oftentimes crediting it and bringing people along with them. And I think that's an amazing thing, that we have a subject that could be defunded in any state at any moment. And yet right now, most of what's in the newspaper couldn't be in there if historians hadn't already written about it or told journalists about it. So I guess my feeling about the field we're in, Civil War history, is a long way from 2020 Black Lives Matter or even Democratic Party politics. But people can't really it's quite obvious, people can't really make sense of the present without asking us about the past. And so I think we just have to kind of be there, to play this role in the classroom, see what happens. I think it's going to be a different environment for history teaching after this. It's not a great answer, but it's a very modest answer, but that's sort of how I feel about it, that We're energized by this. The relevance of what we do is we are reminded of the importance of what we do. We can share it, but our role is many times in the background. Although periodically people are called upon to step forward, and they're, like I was just reading the review of Isabel Wilkerson's book in the New Yorker, and people take such shitty, cheap shots at historians. It's beyond me. Even this guy, he says, she wrote a book about the Great Migration that was much more precise and something than professional historians. And I thought, wow, that's egregious. Like, why knock historians? First of all, a lot of people really can write. I'm sorry. And they make that knowledge available. And we aren't synthesizers. We're often digging out new knowledge, bringing new questions to the past. So I think I think this moment has been a reminder that we have a role to play, and it's in the role we're already in part.
I think that leads to one last question that we want to ask, and we're taking the liberty of going over time. So thank you to everyone who's here, and that's most everyone who was here in the first place. And obviously, we can't make you stay or anything like that, but we'll be posting the video of this conversation later in case you have to go. But this wouldn't be a conversation about the Confederacy and the present moment and historians' roles if we didn't ask you a question about monuments. And so obviously, part of the stir and the conversation this summer has been about renewed protests, about the continuing presence of Confederate monuments and related monuments, particularly in public places, and also to some extent in places like battlefields that are run by the National Park Service. And I know you've said publicly in a kind of general sense, you think the monument should come down, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I mean, I'm always really taken by the analogy which you raised earlier about sort of the idea that these monuments were ever permitted to go up in the first place, when this was a treason. The Confederacy was basically a treasonous act against the United States that was defeated. And so how was it ever possible that there was a movement to kind of create these monuments and honor the people who created this kind of effort, when most countries don't do their history and their memorialization like that? But, what do you say to people about the issue of monuments now, and where do you think people and communities should come down on these kind of conversations?
Well, I think it's been an amazing series of events, and the momentum is unbelievable. Like, you couldn't have predicted this. There was this stuckness to the subject before, right? I mean, it was bogged down in local politics and city ordinances and all kinds of things, and people, African American Southerners had been trying for years to get these things removed, rightly so, and they had allies, white allies, and there was so little happening for so long. And now, it's like they're throwing statues of Stalin into the river. I mean, it's fantastic. It's an amazing thing. But I'm not the right person to think through the nuances of this. Like, I don't know what to do with these statues. I'm not a museum person. Most of them are not aesthetic treasures. I don't think we're losing much in the world of art. I mean, I've read about, the Roosevelt statue at the National Museum of American History. There are various things. There are distinctions to be made. The St. Gaudens Memorial, is that how you say it, in Boston Commons, maybe isn't how we would make a war memorial now, but it's not just a hollow tin statue that was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, mass produced for every courthouse, in the southern states. So I know that there are questions, including aesthetic questions, but I think the question about public space to me is very simple. Like, why should African American citizens and taxpayers have to send their children to schools that are named after Confederates, drive their cars on roads that are named after Confederates, walk into courthouses with memorials to Confederate officers or generals in front of the courthouse? These were put up as symbols of intimidation. We know that. That's why they were put up. And I don't have any problem. I mean, I'm not involved in the local battles over these things. From my point of view, they should come down. I also think that we have to put things up. and you guys have been involved in this with the Reconstruction, National Park Service Reconstruction historic sites. I'm a big admirer of what EJI does, the Equal Justice Initiative. I think the idea of putting slave markers in cities in the United States where slave markets were held, they've done it for Alabama. The lynching memorial, the indications of these things on the landscape, other things also, obviously, in other kinds of history, women's history, also, because what we have is a very weird monument landscape, right? We don't exactly have a rich monument landscape. We have a way too many military people of all kinds, and so the stuff about the founding fathers who were slaveholders, I think that's a different question. I wouldn't lose any sleep over any of them coming down personally, but I understand why some people would. And I think that's a different question. They were not engaged in a treasonous war against their own country. Robert E. Lee was educated at taxpayers' expense, and then at US taxpayers' expense. And then, I mean, seriously. So I think it's a combination of they should come down. I don't think our fellow African-American citizens should have to live in this landscape. It was there to assert white supremacist power, and it's got to come down, and it's got to be changed. But I think we need a richer monument landscape, and I don't relish those conversations. When people ask me, what about the Central Park, women's suffrage? It's like, don't ask historians who they want monuments put up to, I guess, but because we know too many people that nobody else cares about. But it's a move in the right direction. But I'm also just a believer that we have to mark a different and richer history on the landscape.
Well, Stephanie McCurry, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts on the Confederacy, your tremendous work over the course of 3 different, very interconnected books. I think it's been inspiring. I hope that a lot of people will have ideas popping out of their heads about things they can think about, both in their own research and teaching. And so we're very grateful for your willingness to be here, and thank you so much. I just want to quickly repeat our schedule. Oh no, but it just disappeared off my screen. I had it all ready to go. Greg, can you bail me out here? We're just going to quickly re-announce it.
Again, this will be up on our YouTube page, pretty reasonably quickly. Our next talks are Wednesday, August 19th at 4 p.m. with Dr. Thomas Brown on Civil War monuments and the militarization of America, based in part upon his recent prize-winning book. And then we have the week after that, our rescheduled talk with Dr. Tara Hunter of Princeton on emancipation during the Civil War, which will be Wednesday, August 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And the link to register is on the chat function, was added by Cecily Zander and Matt Isham on the chat function. And we should also thank them for their incredible work in making all of this come together and, making up for our, or at least my, occasional technical deficiencies and lapses. So they're the ones who keep it running and keep the word getting out there. And we couldn't do it without them.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye.